It started from a single album. It became a double album. We went through 3 covers. I said, that's not expressive. And finally, they gave me that beautiful Abe Gervin cover.
Yeah.
And the record came out. You know, I was pretty much allowed to do anything. And I always think, you know, there's a lot of what we call garage rock on it. The term hadn't been invented yet. But really, it's just interesting records. There's, you know, Sagittarius, which is orchestral rock, a la the Beach Boys. There's music business savvy songwriters jumping on bandwagons like the Strangeloves. There's actual garage rock, the Seeds and the Shadows of Night. But, you know, what it is a moment in time when anything seemed possible in rock and roll. When it became the art it was destined to be. And I was a teenager in those mid-'60s years, starting my own bands. And so in a weird way, it's kind of my autobiography of the sense of idealism I felt about what the music could accomplish.
It's amazing, really, because if you think about it, it's almost a love letter, your love letter to the 60s. And at that point in time, did it seem like it was nothing more than, which is more than enough, but serving up a bunch of curios to people, like-minded people who maybe hadn't heard them before?
Well, I mean, curios that were only 4 to 5 years old. I mean, I started making that list at the end of 1970 when most of those records were, you know, hardly history. I didn't really have any perspective. I was just going by instinct. I always like to joke that if I'd known I'd be yakking to you, Mark, 50 some years in the future, I would have screwed that record up because I would have felt the weight of history. But I was just putting a bunch of records that seemed to me to be aligned in some weird spirit. And I always think that my 2 role models for that album, one, they used to have albums on television, you know, 20 greatest hits. In the early 60s, they had these albums with motorcycle hoodlums on them. Yeah. Rock and roll was so, you know, outlaw. And, you know, they were like golden oldies albums. But I also loved Yazoo records, those blues scholarship records, you know, blues in, you know, Southeast Georgia, 1927 to 1933, with liner notes that, you know, talk about, you know, all these arcane things that the blues musicians themselves probably had no idea about. So I just kind of followed my instincts. And, you know, I believe it speaks to what I call the original sin of rock and roll, that moment where you pick up a guitar and you turn it up and the amplifier howls back at you and you realize that this is expressing something deep within you. I know it did for me. I was a mutant kid in New Jersey. I wasn't good at sports. I was not particularly good at school, but I loved the outro. And when when I first picked up that guitar in the wake of the Beatles and the English invasion, you know, all of a sudden I could feel a certain creative energy flowing through me. I never realized I would be still playing all these many years in the future. It was too much to dream for. But, you know, the present tense of music was just so exciting. And I was able to express that in a weird way in Nuggets and have it serve as an inspiration for the next generation of musicians coming through.
Well, that's the key, really. I mean,
scaled back.
Yeah, not only the bands who were included on Nuggets, but I know from first-hand experience that it made a massive, massive difference in the UK. I know it did worldwide, really. But when I joined The Fall in 1978, Mark Smith had a copy, and as a result, he was a massive fan of The Seeds and 13th Floor Elevators and more. And then you've got the ones who came slightly afterwards. You've got Julian Cope and the Jesus and Mary chain, most of the Creation label owed a debt to your release. So you weren't only kind of like responsible for rejuvenating the careers of those bands who were on Nuggets, but you also kind of helped the careers of so many bands to come afterwards by showing them the way with this material that they would probably not have heard.
And bringing it back to a certain sense of basics. I mean, when Nuggets came out, you know, progressive rock, and I like progressive rock, don't get me wrong. Yeah. I love all musics. But the fact is that there was no real entry level for aspiring musicians that, you really, and it's great every once in a while in rock's cyclical, passage of evolution to bring it back to the basics, to bring it back to those three chords and to pick up that guitar and learn how to play a song in 20 minutes. I mean, that's not to say that the songs on Nuggets are simple, because as you unravel them, as we did in the rehearsal room in Shepherd's Bush, there's a lot of quirky stuff going on in them. And, Lord love the band for being able to say, wait a second, there's this little thing happening beneath the vocal that makes the vocal stand out. They're not unsophisticated records, but what they are very immediate. And I have to say, in Europe, the 13th Floor Elevators had a medium-sized hit. The Seeds had a medium-sized hit. But in Europe, nobody had heard of the 13th Floor Elevators or the Seeds. And that's why when I went over the first time with Patti, and we're in Copenhagen at our first show in Europe, and I'm excited, and, we're at the press conference, and somebody says to me, when is the next Nuggets coming out? And I'm thinking, have you actually heard of Nuggets? That's so amazing. I mean, it seems to have a life of its own. And again, I wasn't in those bands. I didn't invent that music. I just helped curate it and celebrate it. And the fact that it's still being remembered all these many years later as a touchstone for the elemental forces of rock and roll, that is a really gratifying thing. It
must be, and also it must be quite bamboozling if you sit down and think of the millions of dollars that you must have generated for the bands on it. I will repeat myself here: the bands on it, and all of the bands who came afterwards who plundered the kind of spirit of Nuggets, because it's an industry. That one record is an industry.
It's rather amazing, but I have to say it's generated many free beers for me all over the years.
Good.
And I'm very grateful for that.
Good, okay. And also there's a claim that the word punk in relation to music was first used on Nuggets. There's another line that says that Lester Bangs may have been the person who called, I think, maybe the Stooges actually, punk in the first place. What's your take on that?
It was, the word was around in rock writer circles. Let's be honest. I didn't invent it, but then it was a sensibility. It wasn't like the genre that it would become templated, I must say, by the ones. I think of the early CBGB's bands as having a punk sensibility. I mean, everybody used it. Lester used it. Dave Marsh, I think, sometimes is credited with the first use of it. Myself and Greg Shaw in correspondence referred to it. It was a word that still hadn't come into its definition yet, which is, of course, about garage rock as well. Garage rock hadn't come into its definition, because when you define something, you limit it. And what I like about Nuggets is that its borders are really blurry. Some of it is not garage or punk or any of the above. Most of it is music that is reinventing itself. And that to me is the most exciting thing about music. In my book, Lightning Striking, 10 Transformative Moments in Rock and Roll, I trace these mergings of time and space, whether it's, Memphis in 54 or Liverpool in 62 or, London in 77. And I find that the most interesting parts are the first couple years when these scenes are generating themselves, because nobody knows what's happening.
Yeah, the Trailblazers.
The definition.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, all kinds of influences. Brian Eno calls it scenius, which is not just the bands on stage at the Cavern, but the audience, what they bring to it, what they want, where the state of the music needs to be reacted against.
Well, there's that cliche, isn't there?
Couple years.
Sorry, yeah, there's that cliche about, the Velvet Underground only sold a handful of records, but everybody who bought the record went out and formed a band. So there's all of these kind of, the history. But if there's one kind of personal to this particular programme, that touches us as regards Nuggets is that we had the Seeds live in session around about 3 years ago. It's Daryl Hooper and the current, obviously, lineup of the Seeds. But
but he plays that great solo.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, I died and went to heaven that night. So, and yeah, we have you to thank, Lenny Kaye. So, I can't thank you enough also for coming on and talking to us. It's been a bit of a troll getting here, but we got there in the end. And thanks so much for doing the session for us. We're thoroughly enjoying it.
It was so great to be in Maida Vale.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the bonus beat. They said, we're going to do a recording before the first show. And I thought, oh my God, this is what we need. And I walked into that gorgeous studio where Bing Crosby recorded his last session, one of my heroes. And, man, it was just so great. And I thank you so much for, spreading the word and organizing the session. And of course, being the station where so much of music is disseminated into the world, so much rock and the world music that you do. I mean, I love the BBC and I'm always tuned into it. So
brilliant. Okay, well, there's a mutual
part of it.
There's a mutual fan club going on, Lenny. So once again, you take care and enjoy your time in Oxford. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Say hello to all my UK friends.
I will do.
Take care, Mark.
And you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Lenny.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye.